We're changing things up this time. This is PowerShell for Hackers, a 3-part series showing you how to use one of Windows' most powerful tools like an attacker. We're talking about popping shells, sneaking out data, and living off the land. PowerShell's got it all, and it is already sitting right there on most of your computers. So these are real techniques that we've pulled from real red team operations, real breaches, and real cases out there in the world. This series is brought to you by in partnership with ThreatLocker. They know PowerShell is a critical part of legitimate workflows, and blocking it outright isn't always the answer. ThreatLocker's ring fencing gives you control, like stopping PowerShell from accessing the internet while still allowing for local automation. That is the kind of defense that keeps attackers boxed in without breaking your devices. To help break ththese down, I've teamed up with Jacoby, one of the most talented hackers that I've had the pleasure to meet and work with, to show you exactly how it all works in practice. Let's get into it. Before we jump into the content, if you like this kind of content, drop me a comment saying shell so I know you want to see more. Okay, so let's just assume I know nothing about PowerShell, and I really don't. What do I need to know? Like, where do I start? What do I do? What's something like, you think some of the things that you think any hacker should know when it comes down to PowerShell?
PowerShell is one of the programming languages that comes standard with Windows. Typically comes with 5 unless you're Windows 11. That will come with PowerShell 7. There's not much of a distinguishing difference between like the net core functionality. That's not something you got to jump into right away. For a lot of people, they think that PowerShell is just a language that admins will use for little things, copying files from one location to another, or moving through different settings, or just little things like that. Once you start to get a little more creative with it, there's a lot more that you can do, especially from a hacker's perspective. It's just a lot of these admin guys, they don't typically look at it that way. Little things like netsh command WLAN show profile. You can name your Wi-Fi profile and hit key equals clear at the end. This is a quick way to get the Wi-Fi password of whatever your system you're on. So this is like one of the recon things you might be able to do for some sort of lateral movement or something along those lines.
So what all can you do with PowerShell? Like, I know you mentioned you can get someone's like Wi-Fi password if you're on the system or if you're on the Wi-Fi or whatever, right? Like, what is the cutesy thing you can do? Like, I think that the Wi-Fi password is one of them. But what's something like, craziest thing that you have accomplished maybe with PowerShell at a high level?
Probably one of the coolest, biggest projects that I took on, that I've been working on over the last 2 years to make sure it's as efficient as possible and undetectable, is I set up an API endpoint that generates a reverse shell for me. That way I can pull it down and execute it with a single line of code, as opposed to a lot of the different resources you see online where it's, a bigger paragraph, and then you have to get that all onto their system and slightly modify it so we can get past Defender. So down here at the bottom, this is my Linode computer that I've hosted in the cloud. It's an Ubuntu server, but I do have PowerShell installed onto it, so I still am using PowerShell. But you can just set up a nice little netcat listener, easy enough. And then I set up an API endpoint where all you have to do is come up here, pass in the IP address of your listener box down here in the port that you want to connect to. You can pull down a reverse shell that it's polymorphic. So every single time that you pull it down, like I'll just show you for an example, every time you pull it down, it's going to give you a new version of it that is scrambled and hasn't been run before. So it has no signature really to detect. It's not easy to detect. There are certain things that someone that's advanced enough can look for. But instead of just posting it and pulling it down, what we're going to do is we're going to pipe it into IEX, and that will give us an instant shell on this machine. So if I run whoami, I did set up my whoami command to run, to output I am the ghost in the machine instead of my real name. Yeah. On someone else's computer, typically you would get their real name, and then from here I have full control over this PC from my cloud instance, running something like a calc command just to show that it's working. Pop calc.
Okay, hold that thought, because I feel like I think we're gonna get to this eventually. I love this. What do I need to understand from a system perspective or from a PowerShell perspective before I could do any of these things? Like, I'm primarily Linux guy, everything I do is like some sort of a Linux operating system. I'm kind of used to, having default processes and default binaries that come with your system, and you can sometimes hijack them and do things that are malicious with it. Or sometimes you can hijack a process, go to GTFO bin, and you can get a reverse shell, or you can get privilege escalation. Is there something similar to that on with PowerShell? Is there default things you can rely on that could be used for malicious purposes, even though that's not the intention behind it.
Yes, absolutely. So, like we were talking about, PowerShell itself is a low bin. There's actually a really awesome resource online that I use pretty frequently. This is a website called the Lobos Project, and this entire website itself is filled with all the different low bins that you could typically find on a Windows system. And they got them separated down to whether it's reconnaissance, execution, download, upload, alternate data streams, copying files over. There are certain commands that, like Linux, are probably monitored pretty often. Like for you guys, you have curl. Over here, we have invoke web request and invoke rest method, which is something that's commonly used to pull down malware from different places so you can execute it. With those being monitored as much as they are, sometimes you might want to look for a different version, something else that you could run to replicate the effects of those commands while still trying to stay under the radar.
So these are, when you say LOL bins or LOL bins, these are by default on your machine with a fresh install.
Correct. Not necessarily all of the ones that you see listed here, but LOL bins themselves typically are. This website also includes some ones for things that are kind of often downloaded as well to like a lot of different systems, whether it be like Pester or like Microsoft Teams.
Yeah.
Most common programs.
Yeah, most common programs that are set up on a machine, especially from an enterprise perspective or like popularity, right?
Correct. So, well, I would say that most of these do come on the machine by default often. There are some of them that are programs that are more commonly downloaded in corporate environments. You can still go through here and look and try to find a bunch of different resources. Now, to make the process just a little bit easier, I did also make this GitHub repo, which is also a PowerShell module that you can download directly to the console. And it comes with a bunch of these different commands that you'll see right here, whether it's updating the low bin data directly from that website right here, or just for example, probably one of the more important ones that you would be running. If you see right here, we have test low bin paths. So if we run test low bin paths, what this particular command will do, this command gives you the ones that are specifically on the system that you just ran that on. All of these ones that you see here listed currently, these are on the current system, on my system right now. So these are all the different ones that you can take advantage of. In order to be able to run these though, you'd have to assume that you are able to download this module onto your system, which that in itself might be a problem depending on if they're monitoring what modules are able to be downloaded. I actually have kind of a workaround for that as well that I did. Inside one of my payloads right here, I have one of my payloads is called Get PowerShell Gallery Module Code. So if we come into here, I have a script right here called Get Module Code. So whenever you go to use a PowerShell module, you actually have to install it, and you have to go through a sequence of events, like make sure the NuGet package is available so it can be downloaded, and make sure that they're not monitoring and like whitelisting or blocking different modules that they don't want on the system. So this particular payload right here, Get Module Code, if we copy that and we go back to our PowerShell window, we're going to go ahead and clear the screen. We're going to run that. Clear, get module code, and then we can run it on lobins, which is the specific module that we were just looking at. And what that did is it just loaded the code from that module into this instance without actually downloading it.
So loading modules, is that something very common that you have to do as a part of using PowerShell as an attacker or as a hacker, I'll put it?
Correct. So if you were wanting to actually get this module onto the system without using that workaround right there, you would have to use install module. But depending on what environment like what they're running on their system, this is something that might be monitored. It might be blocked, which does sometimes happen. And then so if you do run it, like I'm doing right here, it goes through a little process. And since I already have this on the system, see, look, it says it's an untrusted repository. And you have to say yes to continue to download it, where sometimes you won't even make it this far and they'll shut you down before you get that opportunity, or it's something it'll send a flag over to whoever's watching their system, and it might alert them. If we're trying to stay low bin, you don't necessarily want to download stuff onto their system. So we can use, like I said, we can use this payload here to actually access the website PowerShellGallery.com, which is where they store all that code. So we're actually just going to the individual pages, finding the code inside of that page, parsing it out, and then pulling it down filelessly, which means you're not downloading it to a file, you're saving it right to the system, and you're running it inside this instance. So when I open a new PowerShell window and I close this old one, that code is now gone. It's not anywhere on the system. It'll be in the PowerShell history, so you'll see like that's the last command that I ran, but you could always wipe the history, at the end of your jobs as well. That way it was fileless before, there's nothing saved to disk, and then you could wipe the commands that you ran from history so they aren't there as well. That might be monitored as well, but an attempted cleanup is still something worth looking into.
You mentioned curl earlier, and as with web especially, and when you get reverse shell and things like that, curl is one of the biggest commands that I rely on, and it's usually most of the time by default available to me as a user. What are some equivalent commands that you think I should know as someone that's just getting started with PowerShell?
Going into PowerShell, there really are two different versions of curl. You technically have curl in PowerShell, but curl is just an alias for invoke web request. So this is the closest equivalent. For invoke web request, I'm usually using that when I'm trying to do things like getting headers from a website or some basic information. So you see we use invoke web requests on PowerShellForHackers.com. We get like the status code, the content of the HTML, the raw content, the headers. That's helpful for you bug bounty hunters. I was doing a lot of your labs, for example, and I was trying to do as much of them as I could using just PowerShell alone. That's kind of like my challenge thing. So for me, whenever I was going through to do a lot of your challenges, or even when I was going through to do the Portswigger training, I was using invoke web request a lot to grab the headers, or sometimes you can see the different settings for the cores, see if there's any kind of cores misconfigurations. So we have invoke web request that I typically would use for that. Now there's a second version, it's called invoke rest method. Now to make it easy to understand, invoke web request will grab everything that you see here. Now if I wanted to grab, like for example, if I wanted to grab the status code, what I would do is I would put this into braces like this, or if I wanted to grab the header since it's already there, you would do it inside of the parentheses and then do dot headers. That'll get you all the headers, etc. And if you see in here, I do have a couple interesting ones. Like I have a command. I can also do invoke headers. So then I would put that in parentheses, do dot command, and then pipe that in IEX to open the calculator.
Oh, so you can modularize what you get from the responses pretty much. You can say, I want to get the header and specifically this header name, and I want to pipe that result into a command.
Correct. So IEX, invoke expression, is what you use to run commands inside of PowerShell. So anywhere that you can grab a string from, you can take that string and throw it into invoke expression and it'll run it. You can put little PowerShell commands in a bunch of different places, in the headers of websites, inside of DNS text records, or like right here, you see I put it in a header. So I can grab that individual header command and then pipe it into IEX.
Is IEX by default set up on the machines usually?
Yeah, that is probably the most watched command though. So when you talk about low bins and looking for ways to find alternate ways to execute things without using invoke expression, that is where that site, for example, comes in handy, because invoke expression is watched so tightly.
So if I have some like EDR or some whatever on my Defender on my machine, try and pipe something to IEX, not gonna work, right?
I wouldn't say it's not gonna work per se, because it is needed so often, but it is going to be heavily monitored and it will be flagged. Yeah, most systems where they're really serious about their security, they will flag, log, and check every invoke expression command that does come through, because it is the #1 used command for loading in malware.
Okay, so I'm going to assume IEX is something that you probably should know, even though it's probably not like super useful anymore. How would that work? Let's say if you wanted to do to use it, how would I use it? Do I always have to pipe things into it, or can I use a standalone? Can you show me an example of it?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I'll do is I need to pull open my notebook real quick, and I could show you a quick example. For those of you guys that are watching, and if any of you are familiar with a lot of my payloads that I used to make for like the Flipper or the Hack 5 devices, this was like the #1 way that I made those one-liners for you guys to use. So what you would have is you would have like a GitHub, right? The raw text, the raw file inside of a GitHub, it would just contain a big PowerShell script. And just to give you guys the quick difference between invoke web request and invoke REST method, which is what I'm about to show you. If you use invoke web request, it gives you everything that you see here. If you use invoke REST method, which is what we're about to use, it specifically grabs you the content. So instead of putting invoke web request in parentheses and then doing .content, you can just use invoke REST method instead. That's what I use most often when I'm trying to download the content of a file directly.
So it gives you no headers.
Correct. It gives you no headers. It gives you just the
Response
content
body.
directly. Yes, exactly. You can type out invoke web request, or you can type IWR, which is its shorter alias, and instead of invoke REST method, you can just type IRM, right? So that's what I'll be doing here. Now right here, I have a URL. This is a short link that I made with Brandly that pointed to a GitHub raw file. Those are really long URLs, so I don't like to use it. You know, it's just lengthy. But what we're going to do is we're going to pull it down using invoke REST method. This is one of my reverse shells that I have hosted somewhere. So what you would do is you would pull it down. That is the reverse shell. And then I can just show you a little example of it working just real quick. You would typically have a netcat listener running somewhere, like I do on my Linode box right here. You would do the same command, right? And then we were just talking about invoke expression. Instead of typing that out, you can just type IEX. So IRM, the URL, and then pipe it into invoke expression. And then we'll go ahead and make it easier. So we'll set it here. If you'll pay attention right here, as soon as I run this, that tiny little one-liner, and I now have full control over this computer again. Just like before. And then popcalc, just, a little demo. Invoke REST method, invoke web request, and invoke expression. As far as wanting to get malware on the system and running it quickly, those are the commands that you would definitely go through.
Is it common to have IRM be heavily monitored too, or is that not a thing?
It's hit or miss. I got to be honest, I don't really have it get caught very often because, once again, it's something that so many other modules for sysadmins use to grab their resources as well. So whenever they're updating their scripts, or whenever they're pulling down updates, or they're pulling down files, or whatever else, they also use it so much. It just happens to be one of the ones that are monitored. I know that later on we'll be diving into some of these logins, the actual individual login examples more, and I can show you guys a couple workarounds for these commands. Like, there are other, commands that you can use to pull down code without using invoke REST method, without using invoke web request. I can actually, since we got a little time, I'm going to cut this off real quick. So now we've lost connection. You see that it came back here. We're going to clear this out. I'll show you one of them real quick. This is a little bit more advanced. You don't have to try to fully understand it right now. But certrec is another one of the commands that's inside the login library that I just showed you from earlier. So this will be a substitute for invoke web request or invoke REST method. Certrec is used to pull down certs, and we won't super dive into it, but if you notice, it's a post. It's not even like what would be a poll, which we don't have, and it's looking for a config. We're going to pipe it in that same URL right here that I just used with invoke REST method and pass it into Windows win.ini. Now we have to split up and recombine things, do a little skip and trim, but long story short, it is another way to pull down that same file without using invoke REST method. So it's one of the less common, more obscure ways to get access to that information without having to use something that gets alerted to as much.
I think with PowerShell, there's more ways to invoke a web request and things like that than there is with Bash. What are people that are watching this? They go, okay, I'm personally intrigued by this, dude. I just want to learn PowerShell at this point. What do I do? Like, what are some resources I can use, and then also like, what are some things I should be aware of or learn on my own to get good at this?
The cool thing about PowerShell is that in order to get good with it and to be able to use it in a hacking sense, you do have to get really creative. There are a lot of really good resources out there. The Lobin website that I pulled up earlier, to be honest, even if you don't know PowerShell that well, you don't understand the full syntax of the language, I think it would be really good to go through that website and just look through the individual Lobins that they have on there and see if you can just conceptualize how they work. You don't even necessarily have to get them working per se. Learning from other people how they look at different areas, it's kind of hard to conceptualize without peeking through it. They got pretty good descriptions on there to go through their different methodologies and everything. And don't be afraid to use ChatGPT either. If you want to take one of those Lobins, pop it in and say, hey, can you explain this to me a little bit more in depth? You might not be able to get to run it right away, but it's, a lot of people talk about the hacker mindset, just learning to look at things from different angles. And once you kind of start to understand how some of those work, you'll kind of get the idea in your head, the building blocks. So you can just start going through random PowerShell commands, just use get command, go through different modules, go through different sections of code, and start trying to pick out how you can maybe tweak something to use it in a way that's not, anticipated, we'll say.
That's a wrap for episode 1. Like I said, this is something new that I'm trying. So if you enjoy content like this, please hit that subscribe button and drop me a comment if you'd like to see more series like this. Next PowerShell video drops a week from today. So stay tuned and I'll see you all in next week's video. Peace.